The world headlines. Official review of Trump phone logs from January 6 finds record is complete.
In the 7 hours during which White House records show no phone calls to or from then-President Donald Trump on January 6, 2021, among the calls that are conspicuously absent is one Trump made to then-Vice President Mike Pence that morning from the Oval Office. While the call is not specifically noted in the presidential diary or the presidential call log, its existence has been corroborated by multiple sources who were with Trump and Pence that day, including former aides who testified before the House Select Committee investigating the U.S. Capitol attack. And it's not the only call Trump is known to have made in that time frame that is not reflected in the records. The mystery of the 7-hour gap has fueled furious speculation as to why calls are missing. That includes allegations that Trump was using burner phones, which he has denied, or that the logs were purposely suppressed. But the gap might have a less mysterious explanation. According to multiple sources familiar with Trump's phone behavior and the White House switchboard records, the January 6 log reflects Trump's typical phone habits. He mainly placed calls through the switchboard when he was in the residence, but rarely used it when he was in the Oval Office. The fact the log does not show calls on January 6, 2021, from the Oval Office is not unusual, said the sources, because Trump typically had staff either place calls directly for him on landlines or cell phones. Those calls would not be noted on the switchboard log. The 6 pages of White House switchboard logs for January 6, 2021, are completely based on an official review of White House records, according to a source familiar with the matter.
Justice Department widens January 6 inquiry to range of pro-Trump figures.
Federal prosecutors have substantially widened their January 6 investigation to examine the possible culpability of a broad range of figures involved in former President Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, people familiar with the inquiry said Wednesday. The investigation encompasses the possible involvement of other government officials in Trump's attempts to obstruct the certification of President Joe Biden's Electoral College victory and the push by some Trump allies to promote slates of fake electors, they said. Prosecutors are also asking about planning for the rallies that preceded the assault on the Capitol, including the rally on the Ellipse on January 6, 2021, just before a pro-Trump mob stormed the Capitol. The federal investigation initially focused largely on the rioters who entered the Capitol, an effort that has led to more than 700 arrests. But the Justice Department appears to have moved into a new phase, seeking information about people more closely tied to Trump. This development comes amid growing political pressure on Attorney General Merrick Garland to move more aggressively on the case. A grand jury sitting in Washington is investigating the rallies that preceded the storming of the Capitol, a person familiar with the matter said. One of the subpoenas, which was reviewed by the New York Times, sought information about people classified as VIP attendees at Trump's January 6 rally. It also sought information about members of the executive and legislative branches who had been involved in the planning or execution of any rally or any attempt to obstruct, influence, impede or delay the certification of the 2020 election.
3 men sentenced to federal prison on charges related to human trafficking.
3 men have been sentenced to federal prison in separate but related cases in which they admitted providing forced labor for South Georgia farms. Javier Sanchez Mendoza Jr., 24, of Jessup, Georgia, was sentenced to 360 months in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy to engage in forced labor. Aurelio Medina, 42, of Brunswick, was sentenced to 64 months in prison after pleading guilty to forced labor, and Yadon Velasquez Victoria, 45, of Brunswick, was sentenced to 15 months in prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy, said David H. Estes, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. Mendoza and Medina are citizens of Mexico illegally present in the United States and are subject to deportation after completion of their prison terms. There is no parole in the federal system. These men engaged in facilitating modern-day slavery, said U.S. Attorney Estes. Our law enforcement partners have exposed an underworld of human trafficking, and we will continue to identify and bring to justice those who would exploit others whose labors provide the fuel for their greed. The cases were charged as part of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force investigation, Operation Blooming Onion, which tracked a wide-ranging conspiracy to bring farm under the H-2A visa program under fraudulent pretenses and to profit from their labor by underpaying the workers and keeping them in substandard conditions. The case has been designated as a priority transnational organized crime case in Glen, Wayne, and Pierce counties. He was a leader in a venture to obtain and provide labor and services for farms and other businesses. He did so by recruiting and unlawfully charging more than 500 Central American citizens to obtain H-2A visas.
US being made the scapegoat. Imran Khan?
Pakistan government confirmed on Wednesday, March 30, 2022, that its allegation about a foreign conspiracy against the Prime Minister was based on a diplomatic cable received from one of the country's missions abroad. At a rally in Islamabad on Sunday, Prime Minister Imran Khan claimed that the opposition's no-confidence motion against him was a result of a foreign conspiracy because of his external policy and funds were being channeled from abroad to oust him from power. Though he did not initially provide specific details about the threatening letter, he subsequently opened up a bit because of critics doubting his claim. The government initially offered to share the letter with the Chief Justice of Pakistan, but later the Prime Minister also briefed his cabinet members about the contents of the letter. In view of the legal bar on disclosing classified documents, a group of journalists were then provided with minutes of the cabinet meeting at their interaction with the Prime Minister. No foreign government was named in that meeting, but the media persons were informed that a Pakistani envoy was told by a senior official of the host country that they had issues with Prime Minister Khan's foreign policy, especially his visit to Russia and the stance on the ongoing Ukrainian war. The Pakistani envoy was further conveyed that the future trajectory of relations between the two countries was contingent upon the fate of the no-confidence motion that the opposition parties were then planning to bring against the Prime Minister. The envoy was warned of serious implications if Prime Minister Khan survived the no-trust vote. The cable was reportedly sent on March 7, a day before the opposition submitted the no-confidence motion and requisitioned a National Assembly session for voting on it. Meanwhile, it has separately emerged that the cable was sent by Pakistan's then ambassador to United States Asad Majid.
What's in a job title? In politics, the ballot designation can spark a fight.
In recent days, the increasingly heated battle between Republicans hoping to advance out of the June primary and face Democratic Representative Mike Levin in the November vote to represent the 49th Congressional District has largely focused on just 3 words. Challenger Brian Marriott wanted his job title on the primary ballot to read Certified Financial Planner after years of working in that field. But on March 21, fellow GOP candidate Lisa Bartlett filed a complaint about that, accusing Marriott of trying to mislead voters since he no longer works as a financial planner. The Secretary of State's office said in a statement that staff chatted with Marriott, and his campaign said Wednesday that after he's learned about a trademark conflict with the use of the certified designation, he's switching his job title to businessman/nonprofit executive. From the outside, such distinctions might seem trivial. But the tussle between Marriott and Bartlett is just one of several fights over ballot titles that have popped up in California this election cycle. And the time and money spent over ballot job descriptions illustrates just how crucial candidates feel those few words can be. These 3 words are gold, said Dan Schnurr, politics professor at USC. When Californians look at their June 7 primary ballot, they'll see just 3 bits of information in state and federal races: the candidate's name, his or her party affiliation, and their job title, which in state election law is known as ballot designation. For candidates in nonpartisan local contests, such as county supervisor and board of education races, the list shrinks to 2, name and job title/ballot designation. This is the last message that voters will hear from a candidate before they cast their ballot, Schnurr said. And for low-information voters, who may do little to no outside research about candidates, Schnurr said.
Pompeo's ex-speechwriter criticizes Kamala after another bizarre speech on COVID response in Jamaica.
Kamala Harris is facing increased criticism for continued gaffes and inappropriate laughter during public appearances, with one former Trump-era speechwriter saying her rhetoric undermines American diplomacy on the world stage. America's allies and partners expect our leaders to speak with coherence and clarity on issues that matter to them, former speechwriter for ex-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo David Wildcard told DailyMail.com in a statement. Harris' repeated rhetorical gaffes don't just make her look bad, they undermine American diplomacy, added Wildcard, founder and president of the ghostwriting firm Seventh Floor Strategies. During a meeting Wednesday afternoon, the vice president held a bilateral meeting with Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness to discuss the COVID response on the island. In a speech surrounding the meeting, Harris compounded her communication woes by delivering a bit of word salad. We also recognized, just as it has been in the United States, for Jamaica, one of the issues that has been presented as an issue that is economic in the way its impact has been the pandemic, Harris said. She continued the confusing speech by saying, "So to that end, we are announcing today also that we will assist Jamaica in COVID recovery by assisting in terms of the recovery efforts in Jamaica that have been essential to I believe what is necessary to strengthen not only the issue of public health, but also the economy." Dr. Jonathan Bronitsky, who served as chief speechwriter to then Attorney General Bill Barr, said of the remarks, "An outside observer can only speculate about the reasons for the declining lucidity of Kamala Harris's extemporaneous remarks. Maybe she's distracted, nervous, underprepared, or perhaps some combination of the above."
How war has flipped diplomats' day job.
A day before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Etienne de Ponsens, the French ambassador in Kiev, hosted Mariupol's mayor, Vadim Boychenko, in his office to discuss a more than €60 million French investment in a water treatment plant and other plans for a makeover of the southern port city. He proposed some projects to develop his city, particularly how he wanted to modernize the seafront, recalled de Ponsens. Boychenko now presides over a city in ruins after a month-long battering from Russia's military that has left 100,000 people believed to be trapped without food, water, or electricity. De Ponsens and half a dozen other senior European diplomats have swapped their pre-war ambassadorial duties such as awarding women in business prizes and opening libraries to organize the evacuation of their nationals, help deliver emergency equipment and collect evidence of war crimes. While the US, Germany and the delegation of the EU in Ukraine have transferred their embassy staff to Poland, the ambassadors of France, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Croatia, Latvia and Lithuania have stayed put in the country, with some shifting their offices and accommodation to the western city of Lviv. The Russian assault has turned them into unlikely humanitarians, coordinating their country's medical and logistical assistance on the ground. "Now, I do humanitarian help," de Ponsens said. "I handle the last kilometer for supplies coming from Poland. I go catch them here in Ukraine and then I handle distribution, as well as requests from Ukrainians on what they need. The fact that I am here gives me much more weight," said the French diplomat. "An ambassador is made for being in the country where he is posted. You are here in the difficult moments and hours. I would have felt very bad if I had left," he said.
The blind spots of diplomatic history.
Methodology is not a sexy topic of discussion. But it should be. Nothing is more important to an accurate retelling of diplomatic history than good methods. What we believe happened, how it happened, and why it happened, all come from good methods. Knowledge of methods is equally important for consumers of diplomatic history. If you cannot recognize poor methods, you are more likely to read something and believe it. But you should not read something and believe it. You should read something, analyze it, and then decide to believe it or not. Diplomatic history suffers from several methodological blind spots. These lead to an incomplete telling of the past and the propagation of myths. Some of these blind spots may well apply to other historical disciplines, but as a diplomatic historian, I'll speak to the field I know best. Specifically, I study the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, so I'll anchor most of my critiques and examples from the diplomatic history of that era. I will limit those critiques to the work of senior scholars and famous past historians, whose careers are less vulnerable to criticism. Blind spot number 1, causal inference. The study of history, E. H. Carr once wrote, is a study of causes. The field of history explains what happened in the past and why. Historical works are not merely dry accounts of occurrences, they also all make causal arguments. A causal argument or causal claim can be boiled down to the following: some X causes some Y. It gets more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. A book usually has an overarching causal argument, but there are also hundreds of smaller causal arguments that serve as the scaffolding for the larger argument. Understanding causal inference, the discipline of proving causal claims, is of great importance to every diplomatic historian, but it is neglected. Few, if any, top history departments teach graduate-level courses on causal inference.
Joseph Ladapo hiring violated UF procedures, faculty report says.
The University of Florida violated its own hiring procedures while bringing Joseph Ladapo on board for a tenured position, according to a faculty committee report released Wednesday. The hiring of Ladapo, whom Governor Ron DeSantis picked last year to be the state's Surgeon General, did not adequately involve the input of faculty normally charged with reviewing a candidate's application for tenure, the report found. Administrators accelerated Ladapo's start date to accommodate DeSantis' announcement that the doctor would become the state's next Surgeon General, it said. And some faculty members felt Ladapo was the subject of preferential treatment on the basis of his political opinions, the report said. The irregularities noted above were of concern to the members of this committee and appeared to violate the spirit, and in review the exact letter, of UF hiring regulations and procedures, particularly in the vital role faculty play in evaluating the qualifications of their peers, reads the report, which was compiled by 7 professors from across 5 university sectors. Under his deal with the state and UF, Ladapo is to spend 20% of his time teaching and researching at the university, and 80% of it running the Department of Health. Ladapo, a Harvard-trained physician and researcher, makes $262,000 a year as a professor, plus $75,000 for a role in which he's charged with developing policies and interventions to reduce healthcare disparities for UF Health. Between the UF job and his Surgeon General role, he's paid a total of $437,000 per year. When asked about the report, Department of Health spokesperson Jeremy Redfern dismissed the efforts of the committee.
Keith Krach's tech diplomacy merits the Nobel Peace Prize.
If weakness breeds aggression, then strength deters it and fosters peace. In this age of ever-increasing dependence on free and open access to information, U.S. strength in the information space has never been more necessary to the preservation of peace and the advancement of human welfare. We must be able to trust that the information we use is uncorrupted and accessible at all times. Trust and strength are both indispensable to preserving the peace and prosperity we have enjoyed since the end of the Cold War. Today, no one has advanced these concepts more than Mr. Keith Krach. Which is why I am so proud to endorse his recent nomination for the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. I had the great pleasure of serving alongside Keith during his consequential term as Under-Secretary for Economic Growth, Energy and Environment at the Department of State. Keith's Senate confirmation opening statement detailed his journey from working with his father in a 5-person machine shop in Ohio, through his rapid rise through the ranks of General Motors, and his visionary entrepreneurial leadership as a Silicon Valley titan. Trust was a constant theme throughout his story. Keith is a visionary because he recognized the utility and importance of access to reliable digital information and the associated vulnerabilities presented by the digital age. Very early on, he saw the need to develop digital systems that could emulate millennia of analog trust, handshakes, signatures, the presence of witnesses, etc. In developing DocuSign, he made it possible to trust people at a distance and at the speed of light. Digital trust was a revolutionary concept and has made all our lives better, and increasingly prosperous. Today we often hear the term service applied to military personnel, but service comes in many forms. Answering the call to service, Keith gave up a pleasant West Coast life.
Election year wildcard, gerrymandering by Democrats.
If Democrats manage to hang on to their narrow majority in the U.S. House of Representatives after this fall's midterm elections, it will be because of places like Glens Falls, New York. For years it has been a small spot of blue in a mostly red Adirondack district. But it may become part of a Democratic tilting district under a new map passed last month by the New York legislature, a map that could take the state's 8 Republican House members down to as few as 4. Political map drawing is a powerful tool. While Democrats have decried Republican gerrymandering in recent years, those in some blue states say it's unilateral disarmament if they don't respond in kind. Critics are calling the New York congressional map a blatant gerrymander. On Thursday evening, a Republican state court judge in western New York agreed. The judge tossed the map, writing that it showed clear political bias. But New York isn't the only blue state with warped lines. After years of decrying partisan gerrymandering, Democrats in states from Illinois to Oregon have passed congressional maps that attempt to shore up their own incumbents and eliminate GOP seats. Republicans have produced equally gerrymandered maps elsewhere. Add the work of independent commissions or courts, and the result is a national playing field that, on paper at least, increasingly looks something like a draw. In practice, polls currently suggest Republicans have a strong advantage heading into this fall's midterm elections. If Democrats manage to hang on to their narrow majority in the U.S. House of Representatives after this fall's midterm elections, it will be because of places like Glens Falls, New York. Dubbed Hometown, USA by Look magazine in 1944, Glens Falls has for years been a small spot of blue in a mostly red Adirondack district.
Senator Susan Collins backs Ketanji Brown Jackson. Why that matters.
Maine Senator Susan Collins said Wednesday she will vote to confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, giving Democrats at least one Republican vote and all but ensuring that Judge Jackson will become the first black woman on the Supreme Court. Senator Collins met with Judge Jackson a second time this week after 4 days of hearings last week and said Wednesday that she possesses the experience, qualifications, and integrity to serve as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. I will, therefore, vote to confirm her to this position, Senator Collins said. Senator Collins' support gives Democrats at least a one-vote cushion in the 50-50 Senate and likely saves them from having to use Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote to confirm President Joe Biden's pick. Senate Democratic leaders are pushing toward a Senate Judiciary Committee vote on the nomination Monday and a final Senate vote to confirm Judge Jackson late next week. President Biden called Senator Collins on Wednesday to thank her after her announcement, according to the senator's office. The president had called her at least 3 times before the hearings, part of a larger push to win a bipartisan vote for his historic pick. Judge Jackson, who would replace retiring Justice Stephen Breyer, would be the 3rd black justice, after Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas, and the 6th woman. She would also be the first former public defender on the court. It is expected that all 50 Democrats will support her, though one notable moderate Democrat, Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, hasn't yet said how she will vote. Senator Collins was the most likely Republican to support Judge Jackson, and she has a history of voting for Supreme Court nominees picked by presidents of both parties, as well as other judicial nominations.
The Ukrainians, crushed by the bombs, re-established themselves.
Ukraine has been carrying out attacks in the face of obstacles on many fronts, including diplomacy. According to U.S. intelligence, Ukrainian forces were able to recapture some of the territory lost to the Russians. The Pentagon on Tuesday promised that the Ukrainian military would launch a counterattack. We are sure that the Ukrainians will not just defend themselves, he said. But in recent days they have been making efforts to reclaim territory occupied by the Russians, a senior U.S. official confirmed at a news conference. He noted that for the first time, since the start of the war, the existing military presence in Ukraine has been reduced to less than 90%. Some of their players are suffering from frost because they do not have adequate equipment against the cold, the official said, anonymously for security reasons. They also have problems with food, fuel, and personal equipment. The Ukrainian military is now under attack. In some circumstances, U.S. Defense spokesman John Kirby testified on CNN. We know they carried out counterattacks, especially in recent days in Mykolaiv, a major city in southern Ukraine. We watched CES gains territorios increase in recent days for the benefit of Ukraine, he added. The Ukrainian army counterattacked in the small town of Izium, southeast of Kharkiv, with Russian forces trying to annex the pro-Russian areas of Lugansk and Donetsk. U.S. intelligence sources, quoted by American newspaper The New York Times. It is estimated that more than 7,000 Russians have been killed since the start of the war last week. In addition, Ukrainian civil servants said on Tuesday that about 300 Russian soldiers had left the Sumi region in the northeast of the country. Icy hell, these military gains were made as artillery attacks continued in several Ukrainian cities: Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Chernigiv.
Ukraine war should not hinder Iran deal revival, U.S. analysts say.
For months, detractors of the Iran nuclear deal in the United States have warned President Joe Biden against re-entering the agreement. They have now added Russia's involvement in talks to revive the multilateral pact to their long list of grievances, as Russian forces continue their offensive in Ukraine. However, supporters of the accord, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, say the conflict in Ukraine should intensify, not blunt, efforts to restore it. Nigar Mortazavi, an Iranian-American journalist and analyst, said critics of the JCPOA in Washington will always be there, but the Biden administration must be prepared to face opposition if it wants to revive the agreement. At the end of the day, it's like ripping off the Band-Aid, Mortazavi told Al Jazeera. The president just has to make the decision, spend the political capital, take some public heat, which is what Obama did, and just do it. European, Iranian and US officials have been saying for weeks that a deal is within sight while also stressing that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. According to Mortazavi, the war in Ukraine actually gives Biden more solid footing upon which to restore the nuclear agreement. International sales of Iranian oil, which is currently heavily sanctioned, could help mitigate the global energy crisis created by the war, she said, and the agreement would allow bureaucrats enforcing Iran sanctions to focus on measures against Russia. For all these reasons, I think sooner is better than later, Mortazavi said. But I think the problem with the Biden administration is that they are trying too hard to keep everyone happy. That's just not possible with Iran. Biden and his top aides have emphasized that they are consulting with U.S. congressional leaders and Middle East allies.
Ukraine negotiations to resume, Europe faces Russia gas deadline.
Talks resume, humanitarian corridor for Mariupol to open. Moscow demands European gas buyers pay in rubles. Europe says it will not be blackmailed. Zelensky points to battles ahead in Donbass. European buyers of Russian gas faced a deadline to start paying in rubles on Friday, while negotiations aimed at ending the 5-week war were set to resume even as Ukraine braced for further attacks in the south and east. Moscow's invasion of its neighbor has killed thousands, sent millions fleeing, and galvanized the United States and allies around the world to impose punishing penalties on Russian government entities, businesses, and oligarchs. Russia will respond to European Union sanctions, the RIA news agency quoted a senior foreign ministry official on Friday. The actions of the EU will not remain unanswered. The irresponsible sanctions by Brussels are already negatively affecting the daily lives of ordinary Europeans, Nikolai Kobranets told the news agency. Russian President Vladimir Putin played one of his biggest cards on Thursday, demanding European energy buyers start paying in rubles from Friday or have existing contracts halted. European governments rejected Putin's ultimatum, with the continent's biggest recipient of Russian gas, Germany, calling it blackmail. The energy showdown has huge ramifications for Europe as US officials circle the globe to keep pressure on Putin to stop an invasion that has uprooted a quarter of Ukraine's 44 million people. The International Energy Agency will hold an emergency meeting on Friday to discuss a new release of strategic oil reserves alongside a US plan to pump massive supplies starting in May.
What do Americans think of the Russia-Ukraine war and of the US response?
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has generated much debate in America, not only about how the US should respond, but also about the extent to which the invasion represents a threat to democracy. There have been questions about the extent to which Russia's assault has galvanized public support behind NATO, whether the war has ended the post-Cold War era as we have known it, and about the nature of the Biden administration's response. It has also generated discussion about the degree to which the Russia-Ukraine war has eroded the deep American partisan divide in recent years. I set out to probe public perceptions of these issues in a new poll. It turns out that large majorities of Americans are indeed following the Russian invasion closely, according to our University of Maryland Critical Issues poll. The poll was carried out online between March 16 to 28, 2022 by Nielsen Scarborough, who used a nationally representative sample of 1,320 adults with a margin of error of plus or minus 2.7%. It found that 40% of respondents say they are following the crisis very closely, and another 45% say they are following somewhat closely. Here are 12 takeaways. Americans clearly view Ukraine as being far more friendly than Russia, even if most Americans don't simply consider Russia to be an enemy or Ukraine to be a full ally. 34% of respondents say Russia is an enemy, including 30% of Republicans and 40% of Democrats, while 38% say Russia is an unfriendly country, and 24% say it is neither friendly nor unfriendly. 19% consider Ukraine an ally, while a slight majority of 54% consider Ukraine a friendly country, and 25% consider it neither friendly nor unfriendly. Large bipartisan majorities remain opposed to sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, even if the conflict persists. 65% oppose sending troops, including 68% of Republicans and 62% of Democrats.
Mercenaries linked to Putin may soon join the war in Ukraine.
Since Russia invaded Ukraine, news reports have warned that the hostilities would soon include mercenaries working for a private paramilitary force with close ties to the Kremlin. Some of those reports noted that the Wagner Group, as the mercenary network is known, even though it does not exist as a single corporate entity under that name, has been actively recruiting combatants from other countries where it operates, including Syria. In recent days, Western officials escalated the warnings, predicting that more than 1,000 mercenaries, including the group's top commanders, might pull out of other countries where they have been deployed in order to boost Russia's faltering invasion. Despite those reports, it is not known how many Wagner mercenaries, Russian or not, are currently in Ukraine, though European intelligence officials believe that about 300 entered the country in the weeks leading up to the invasion. This week, Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said that about 1,000 Wagner mercenaries, including Syrians, are currently in eastern Ukraine, though so far there has been no evidence of that. Still, these reports have drawn a spotlight to the Wagner network, which has been connected to war crimes and is widely understood to operate at the behest of Russian intelligence, even as the Kremlin has always denied affiliation to it. Fighting for hire is one of the world's most ancient professions, and a number of countries, including the United States, have long relied on private military contractors in conflict zones, a trend that human rights observers warn is only growing. U.S. mercenaries have committed a series of human rights abuses, including the massacre of civilians, in a number of countries. Private military companies are technically illegal in Russia, a provision that has granted officials there a measure of plausible deniability when Wagner fighters have died abroad, including during a fierce battle against U.S. forces in Syria.
Ukraine, second UN convoy reaches Sumi, Mariupol access thwarted.
Briefing journalists in New York, UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric noted that the first convoy had arrived in Sumi nearly 2 weeks ago, with another interagency relief mission reaching nearby Kharkiv earlier this week. Critical supplies. In today's convoy, which included 7 trucks, delivered food, medicines and hygiene products that will be distributed by the Ukrainian Red Cross Society and its local partners, and that will take place in the days ahead. This included food for nearly 6,000 people provided by the World Food Programme, WFP, and the NGO, People in Need, hygiene products for around 6,000, blankets, sleeping bags and solar lamps for more than 1,500 from the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Critical medical supplies for more than 10,000 people for the next 3 months were also supplied, care of the World Health Organization, WHO. In a statement issued by the Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine, Osnat Labrani, she said the humanitarian notification system with Ukraine and Russia, facilitated by the UN Humanitarian Coordination Wing OCHA, had enabled safe passage for the convoy into Sumi. But this is clearly not enough, she stressed. She added the UN needed to reach the most vulnerable people affected by the grave humanitarian crisis across the whole country. Mariupol, Chernihiv, out of reach. We and our partners have still not been able to reach areas where people are in desperate need of support, including Mariupol, Kherson and Chernihiv, despite extensive efforts and ongoing engagement with the parties to the conflict, said Mr. Dujarric. We are continuing our dialogue with both parties to the conflict with the aim of urgently, immediately and consistently negotiating and facilitating the delivery of critical humanitarian assistance to the people who have been hardest hit by this ongoing war.
Can the US and NATO provide Ukraine with enough weapons?
Russia's faltering campaign in Ukraine and the relative success of Ukrainian forces in fending off the invasion have forced the US and other NATO governments to consider providing military aid for Kyiv on a scale Western leaders never anticipated, current and former officials say. It's not clear, however, that the US and other NATO members can sustain even the current level of weapons deliveries. The White House says that it has moved swiftly in an unprecedented way to get weapons in the hands of Ukrainians fighting the Russian troops, and that US officials are working with NATO allies to keep the arms moving to Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion began on February 24, US cargo planes have unloaded hundreds of anti-aircraft Stingers, thousands of anti-tank weapons, millions of rounds of ammunition and other gear destined for Ukraine's armed forces, according to the White House. The weapons deliveries to Eastern Europe came as President Joe Biden recently approved more than $1 billion of military assistance for Ukraine in less than a week. But these commitments threaten to deplete the existing supplies of some munitions, according to John Schaus of the Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank. Under recent decisions, the United States will deliver about 4,600 Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, the White House says. That would account for more than half of the 8,885 Javelins the Defense Department bought in the past 10 years, said Schaus. Ukraine's ambassador to Britain, Vadim Pristeko, warned last week that its current supply of arms will run out soon as their forces are burning through the supplies at a rapid rate. Canada said it will now purchase military gear to send to Ukraine.
Ukraine uses guerrilla counterattacks to take fight to Russia.
Hundreds of Ukrainians huddled under a shattered bridge in Irpin, outside Kiev, in the early days of the war appeared to show the hopelessness of the Ukrainian cause, as Russian forces advanced on the capital. 5 weeks on, Ukrainian forces have retaken what was left of Irpin after fierce shelling forced the Russians holding it to retreat, one of several territorial gains around the capital and elsewhere in the country in recent days that have put the invaders on the back foot. They, the Russians, thought they would in one quick sprint roll in and capture Kiev, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, commander of the city's defenses, told the Financial Times from a frontline position close to the nearby Hostomel airport. But they lost their best forces, he said. They did not calculate on our ability to mobilize our forces. The Ukrainians have made use of guerrilla-style counterattacks to retake territory and deliver a series of body blows to an enemy that can call on superior forces. Irpin, for example, was supposed to be an easy bridgehead for the Russians to roll into Kiev. But Ukraine's decision to blow up the bridges into the capital delayed Russia's advance, forcing them to try to go around and leaving them exposed to shelling and Western-supplied anti-tank weapons. In several locations, Russian troops and armor were repelled by smaller, highly motivated Ukrainian units who exploited their superior intelligence-gathering capabilities to establish where the enemy columns were located. Our fighting spirit is a main factor, said a commander called Volodymyr from a freshly dug trench outside Kiev. The support from the population has been hugely motivating. They're feeding us, even providing equipment and materials, to dig new trenches. A top Ukrainian commander said on Thursday that Russia's forces had withdrawn nearly 700 military vehicles from positions north of Kiev.
Mobile networks being weaponized to target troops on both sides of conflict.
Ukrainian soldiers have described the dangers of using a mobile phone at the front line in the conflict with Russian-backed separatists in recent years. When you hear a drone, you have about 5 seconds to leave your position and run. The rocket will fly in that fast. New evidence suggests the mobile networks are now being weaponized as an instrument of war in the current conflict, as each side tracks soldiers' phones. How are phones tracked on the battlefield? Devices called cell site simulators, which mimic a phone mast, are stationed inside drones and trucks and sent over the battlefield to pick up the signals of nearby phones. The simulators trick the phones into measuring and reporting the strength and direction of the signal from several phone masts in the area. By analyzing these responses, whether the signal is stronger or weaker with different masts, it is possible to find out where the phones are likely to be and send in an artillery strike at that spot. It is also possible that some systems can directly identify the phone's location when the simulators connect to them, for example by accessing the phone's internal GPS system. Whichever method is employed, and the finer details are closely guarded military secrets, they all end with the enemy obtaining a reasonably accurate location of whoever is using the phone. In Ukraine, it is known that the Russians are using the Lear-3 electronic warfare system, comprised 2 drones and a command truck, as a means to locate Ukrainian forces. This system can pick up more than 2,000 phones within a 3.7-mile range, potentially enabling a whole host of enemy positions to be found. The Ukrainian forces are believed to be using similar technology.
Ukraine's best tank brigade has won the battle for Chernihiv.
When a Russian tank army swept southwest from the Russia-Belarus border region into northern Ukraine on the morning of February 24, a single Ukrainian tank brigade stood between it and the eastern suburbs of Kiev. The Ukrainian army's 1st Tank Brigade was outnumbered, not only by the 10 or so battalion tactical groups belonging to the Russian 41st Combined Arms Army, but also adjacent Russian formations. Incredibly, the 1st Tank Brigade not only halted the larger Russian force in the first few days of Russia's wider war in Ukraine, it swiftly transitioned to an active defense and, for the next 5 weeks, protected the city of Chernihiv, 60 miles northeast of Kiev. The Russians surrounded and cut off Chernihiv, but the 1st Tank Brigade and an assortment of reserve and territorial units held out. On Thursday, the Ukrainians retook the first of several main roads connecting Kiev and Chernihiv, lifting a month-long siege and shifting the momentum along this front toward the Ukrainians for the first time since the Russians attacked. The 1st Tank Brigade is one of the best of Ukraine's 20 active brigades. It includes 3 tank battalions with the latest locally produced T-64BM tanks as well as a mechanized infantry battalion with BMP fighting vehicles. Each battalion on paper includes 40 or 50 vehicles and around 400 troops. The brigade's supporting troops include 3 artillery battalions, one each with 2 S-1 and 2 S-3 self-propelled howitzers and BM-21 rocket launchers, plus air defense troops with Strela 10 and Tunguska tracked missile launchers and guns. Other units, including nearby air defense and artillery brigades, provide additional firepower, including heavier rockets and howitzers and longer-range air defense systems. The 1st Tank Brigade, like many Ukrainian formations, once was part of the Soviet Army, and fell into disarray following the Soviet collapse in 1991.
Putin's support strong in Russia amid Ukraine war.
A new poll released Thursday indicates that Russian President Vladimir Putin has strong support at home, with his approval rating increasing even as critics note that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not gone according to the leader's plan after more than a month of war. March findings by the Levada Center, an independent, non-governmental Russian polling organization, show that Putin's approval percentage actually rose from 71% last month to 83%. Approval of the Russian government as a whole increased 15 percentage points from February to March. A strong majority of respondents, 69%, also believe that Russia is moving in the right direction, after just over 50% believed so in February. About a fifth of those surveyed say that the country is on the wrong path. The poll from the center, widely considered among the only credible pollsters operating in Russia and which years ago was included in the country's register of non-commercial organizations acting as foreign agents, reached 1,632 Russian adults over a week-long span in late March. The results are significant, coming a day after a top U.S. military official cited public support as the key reason Putin felt emboldened to initiate hostilities against Ukraine. Air Force General Todd Wolters, commander of U.S. European Command, told the House Armed Services Committee Wednesday morning that a number of factors contributed to Putin's thinking. But the overriding variable, in my view, Wolters added, is the fact he believes that he has popular support of his citizens. With tight control over the media, Putin's government has largely been able to control the narrative of the war, blaming Western aggression while concealing the mounting losses by Russia amid the war with its neighboring former Soviet state. A Russian military official revealed last week that more than 1,300 of the country's troops have been killed in Ukraine.
The million-dollar question: Ukraine war poised to take center stage at 10th EU-China summit.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is set to take center stage during a virtual high-level meeting between EU and Chinese leaders on Friday, that comes on the heels of months of strained relations. Brussels is bent on pushing Beijing to maintain a hands-off, equidistant approach in the conflict, fearing any sort of intervention could offer the Kremlin a much-needed boost to re-energize its stalled military campaign. China is under intense scrutiny by the international community for its deliberately ambiguous role in the war, which has now entered its second month with no resolution in sight. On the one hand, Beijing has expressed support for Ukraine's independence, called for maximum restraint, and even offered help to secure a ceasefire. But on the other hand, it has criticized Western sanctions against Russia, denounced NATO for its Cold War mentality, and abstained on a United Nations resolution that condemned the invasion. United States officials have warned China is willing to provide Moscow with economic and financial aid to weather the fallout of the hard-hitting sanctions and is also contemplating sending military help. China has vigorously denied the accusations. Brussels says it has so far not seen any indication of military aid. But an encounter on Wednesday between the Chinese and Russian foreign affairs ministers, Wang Yi and Sergei Lavrov, sent a strong signal the two countries are standing together. Both sides are more determined to develop bilateral ties, and are more confident in promoting cooperation in various fields, Wang said while hosting his counterpart for a two-day meeting focused on Afghanistan. China is willing to work with Russia to take China-Russian ties to a higher level in a new era under the guidance of the consensus reached by the heads of state.
War in Ukraine fuels fears among draft-age Russian youths.
As Moscow's forces bog down in Ukraine, many young Russians of draft age are increasingly jittery about the prospect of being sent into combat. Making those fears particularly acute is an annual spring conscription that begins Friday and aims to round up 134,500 men for a one-year tour of military duty. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu pledged at a meeting of the military brass this week that the new recruits won't be sent to front lines or hot spots. But the statement was met with skepticism by many in Russia who remember the separatist wars in the Southern Republic of Chechnya in the 1990s and early 2000s, when thousands of poorly trained young men were killed. I don't trust them when they say they won't send conscripts into combat. They lie all the time, said Vladislav, a 22-year-old who is completing his studies and fears he could face the draft immediately after graduation. He asked that his last name not be used, fearing reprisals. All Russian men aged 18 to 27 must serve 1 year in the military, but a large share avoid the draft for health reasons or deferments granted to university students. The share of men who avoid the draft is particularly big in Moscow and other major cities. Even as President Vladimir Putin and his officials say that conscripts aren't involved in what Russian authorities call the special military operation in Ukraine, many appeared to have been taken prisoner during its initial days. Videos emerged from Ukraine of captured Russians, some being shown calling their parents, and were put on social media. The mother of one of the prisoners said she recognized her 20-year-old draftee son in a video even though he was shown blindfolded. I recognized him by his lips, by his chin. You know, I would have recognized him by his fingers, said the woman, who asked to be identified only by her first name, Lyubov, for security reasons. I breastfed him. I raised him.
Nick Kyrgios unleashes furious attack on tennis chair umpire Carlos Bernardes during loss to Jannik Sinner at Miami Open 2022.
Nick Kyrgios is facing a 5-figure fine and a potential tennis ban after a vicious attack on the chair umpire during his last 16 loss to Italy's Jannik Sinner at the Miami Open. The meltdown marked the second straight tournament the 26-year-old has exited a tournament amid furious scenes, following his explosive loss to Rafael Nadal at Indian Wells in which he was fined $33,000 for nearly hitting a ball boy with a smashed racket. You can watch Kyrgios' heated argument with the chair umpire in the video above. There were early signs that Kyrgios' frustration would boil over on Wednesday morning, AEDT, as he complained about the state of the court almost as soon as he set foot on it. The Australian's attention soon turned to the crowd, who he labeled, the worst, everyone's just the worst. But it was a bizarre moment involving the chair umpire that really pushed Kyrgios over the edge amid his straight sets loss to 20-year-old Sinner. With scores locked at 4-4 in the opening set, the walkie-talkie of Brazilian umpire Carlos Bernardes went off loudly, sparking a heated personal attack from Kyrgios. He should be fired on the spot, Kyrgios said. How is that possible? A fourth round of Miami, one of the biggest tournaments, and you guys just can't do your job. It's embarrassing. Get a new set of referees, these guys don't know how to do S*******. Walkie-talkies, going off. It's a joke. He is a joke. Get rid of every single staff and start over. Everything. I will run the sport. I could do 100 times a better job. Marketing. Everything. You guys have no idea. None. You guys can't even ref right.
UW Football Notebook: How a costly penalty set DB Dominique Hampton on a path to succeed.
Dominique Hampton has paid the price. Now, it's time to profit. Hampton, a fifth-year defensive back from Glendale, Arizona, played sparingly at cornerback in his first 3 seasons in Seattle before finally switching to safety last spring. His 2021 season was derailed by a drive-extending taunting penalty in a 31-10 loss at Michigan on September 11. Hampton was relegated to special teams duty for the next 4 games. If we have some mental missteps with poise, there's always going to be a price to pay, former head coach Jimmy Lake said of Hampton's predicament on September 20. And now you have to earn your trust back, and when that trust is earned back, then more playing time will be given. Hampton re-entered the rotation in the second half of the season and made his first 3 starts against Stanford, Oregon, and Arizona State. He finished with 30 tackles, 2 pass breakups, and a forced fumble in 11 games. The penalty cost him playing time but provided perspective. "I learned I have to keep my cool and I can't let the outside affect what's in here," Hampton said after Washington's first spring practice on Wednesday, pointing to his head. "I've got to keep what's in my head calm, cool and collected. I learned that from 44, bookie, Brendan Radley-Hiles. He told me that last year. Calm, cool and collected, and you're going to be all right." Of course, the physical aspect has never been an issue. At 6'3" and 216 pounds, Hampton has the size to convincingly stuff the run and the speed to competently cover wide receivers. And at his 3rd position in the last 5 seasons, Hampton will have to prove it. "It's sort of a linebacker/corner hybrid," Hampton said of UW's new Husky position, which replaces a traditional nickel. "So you're going to be covering the slot receiver a lot. But you're also going to need to get in the run fit and tackle the running back."
Why greater media coverage of women's sport will provide the platform for equality.
Shaheen Holloway, a former associate head coach and standout student athlete at Seton Hall, has been named the new head men's basketball coach at his alma mater, Director of Athletics Brian Felt announced Wednesday. Holloway will be introduced to the media and the entire university community at a press conference inside historic Walsh Gymnasium. Holloway returns to South Orange after leading St. Peter's on a miraculous run to the Elite Eight at this year's NCAA tournament. The 2020 MAC Coach of the Year, Holloway led the Peacocks to the 2022 MAC tournament title and 3 straight campaigns with 10-plus victories in conference play. Holloway's teams in Jersey City played with a toughness and intensity that mirrored the way he played the game at the Hall, where he holds the program record with 681 career assists and was inducted into the Seton Hall Athletics Hall of Fame in 2012. He becomes the first Seton Hall graduate to lead the men's basketball program since all-time great Richie Reagan 53 led the Pirates from 1960 to 70. "I am incredibly excited to welcome Shaheen Holloway and his family home to Seton Hall," Felt said. Shaheen is a winner in every sense of the word, and he is not only an incredible coach, but also an incredible educator of young men. He works tirelessly to put his student athletes in a position to succeed, and he makes them believe that they can achieve anything with hard work and determination. That is evidenced by his historic NCAA tournament run this month. Shaheen made an unforgettable impact here at Seton Hall, first as a student athlete and then again as an assistant coach, and now we're ready to watch him take over our men's basketball program.
Who warns countries not to reduce testing for COVID-19.
The World Health Organization is pleading with countries not to reduce COVID-19 testing amid a rise of new infections, even as their latest report suggests that cases have fallen globally. According to the WHO's weekly epidemiological report released on Tuesday, the number of new cases reported worldwide between March 21 and March 27 declined by 14% compared to the previous week. Every single region recorded a decline, including the Americas and Eastern Mediterranean, which saw declines of 14% and 32%. While that may sound like positive news, the report notes that the decrease in cases should be interpreted with caution because numerous countries have reduced testing capacity. Several countries are progressively changing their COVID-19 testing strategies, resulting in lower overall numbers of tests performed and consequently lower numbers of cases detected. Despite a generalized decline in the rate of SARS-CoV-2 testing observed across the 6 WHO regions, the number of new weekly cases increased again in early to mid-March, indicating that the virus is currently circulating at very high levels. The report expressed concerns about a significant reduction of COVID-19 testing in several unnamed countries and said the data is becoming progressively less representative, less timely, and less robust. This inhibits our collective ability to track where the virus is, how it is spreading, and how it is evolving, information and analyses that remain critical to effectively end the acute phase of the pandemic. COVID-19 testing has been on the decline in Canada since the beginning of the year and is now back to 2020 levels. The nation's 7-day moving average for tests performed was 41,548 as of March 28, a figure that it hasn't been at since July 2020. In BC, laboratory testing has decreased steadily since December.
Did the Omicron coronavirus surge lead to an increase in MIS-C cases?
The Omicron surge saw record numbers of coronavirus infections and hospitalizations among children. And while children tend to fare better with COVID-19 than older populations, experts were nonetheless worried. Their concerns stemmed from a rare but serious condition that shows up in children after COVID-19 infections. Given an increase in pediatric coronavirus cases, more instances of MIS-C, or multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, were almost guaranteed, they said. The syndrome, which typically shows up 2 to 6 weeks after COVID-19 infection, can involve inflammation of the heart, lungs, kidneys, brain, skin, eyes, or gastrointestinal organs. As Omicron cases started rolling in over the winter, they watched and waited. And while there was an uptick in MIS-C cases nationally, it hasn't been as high as some expected so far, with the extent and timing of the increases ranging across the country. Overall, I am very, very grateful to say that we are just not seeing the MIS-C surge that we feared we would see, says Wendy Hassan, medical director of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Randall Children's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. And I think that is fairly consistent with what the rest of the nation is reporting, as well. Deciphering MIS-C increases. Notably, the small increase in MIS-C cases nationally was less than previous surges caused by waves that produced significantly fewer coronavirus infections among children compared to the Omicron variant. The national average of MIS-C cases reached about 12 per week shortly after coronavirus cases started increasing due to the highly transmissible Omicron variant, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That's up from the all-time low average of just over 1 case per week in July 2021.
Law enforcement seizures of pills containing fentanyl increased dramatically between 2018 to 2021.
NIH-supported research highlights growing, dangerous trend, particularly for people new to drug use. Law enforcement seizures of pills containing illicit fentanyl increased dramatically between January 2018 and December 2021, according to a new study. The number of individual pills seized by law enforcement increased nearly 50-fold from the first quarter of 2018 to the last quarter of 2021, and the proportion of pills to total seizures more than doubled, with pills representing over a quarter of illicit fentanyl seizures by the end of 2021. The study also found an increase in the number of fentanyl-containing powder seizures during this time. This study was published today in Drug and Alcohol Dependence and funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, part of the National Institutes of Health. According to the most recent Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data, the United States hit a record high in the number of overdose deaths ever recorded, estimating that nearly 106,000 people died from drug overdoses in the 12-month period ending in October 2021. This rise is largely driven by illicit fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. Illicit fentanyl is highly potent, cheaply made and easily transported, making it a profitable narcotic. While people may seek out illicit fentanyl intentionally, many people are not aware that the drug they are using, including heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, or benzodiazepines, may actually be fentanyl, or has been adulterated or contaminated with fentanyl. Because fentanyl is about 50 times more potent than heroin and a lethal dose may be as small as 2 milligrams, using a drug that has been laced with fentanyl can greatly increase overdose risk. An increase in illicit pills containing fentanyl points to a new and increasingly dangerous period in the United States, said NIDA Director Nora D. Fokow, MD.